Today we are looking at how mainstream economics derives demand curves from individual preferences. Basically, the individual consumer has the problem to divide her income between the different goods she buys. Her income, or budget, is her constraint and she wants to spend it optimally. Once we know how consumers choose, we can derive the demand. This is the subject of lectures 2 to 4 of the MIT Principles of Microeconomics online course, where you will find a much more in-depth and technical explanation of what I'm discussing here. I've put links in the description. So what does spending optimally mean? What's the criterion for judging what is optimal? Optimal for the consumer is what gives her the greatest satisfaction or utility. This satisfaction is entirely subjective. Everyone likes different things with different intensity. When choosing between different things, we assume that the consumer compares relative prices and the relative satisfaction they get from them. If something's relatively expensive, it has to provide relatively higher satisfaction. Otherwise, you'd be better off spending your money on the cheaper good. To make subjective satisfaction mathematically tractable, we impose 3 conditions on people's preferences to ensure that they choose rationally and that their choices create desirable demand curves. These assumptions create a well-defined preference ordering over everything. The individual can judge whether they prefer one bundle of goods over another or whether they are indifferent between them. For example, they will be able to tell you for certain whether or not they prefer a 2-bedroom bungalow and a dinner with Lizzo over 10 cases of beer and a yacht. These conditions seem okay, but they are actually pretty stringent. So completeness. Can you have a preference over something you don't know? I've never owned a plane. Do I even want one? Transitivity. Can you never change your mind? Once you've tried something, your preferences might actually change. Non-satiation. That's a very tricky assumption. After a certain point, you get sick of things. It's difficult to make sense of in reality. Professor Gruber in the Principles of Microeconomics second lecture tries to make sense of non-satiation by saying you could just throw away an extra cookie or save it for tomorrow. What he says sounds sensible, but he's entirely wrong. You cannot justify non-satiation in this way. If you throw away a cookie, you actually demonstrate that you've reached satiation and break the non-satiation conditions. Saving a cookie for tomorrow is about decision-making between periods, which is not the situation discussed. If you want a cookie tomorrow, you save money and buy it then. Non-satiation means that you actually want to consume ever more cookies in the defined time period. Once preferences satisfy the 3 conditions, one can represent the optimization problem graphically. The problem boils down to the question, how can I make best use of the money I've got? Let's look first at how we represent the budget constraint. You have a certain amount of money you could spend entirely on cookies or entirely on pizzas or anything in between, which is drawn as the red line. If you spend less than your budget, you can also afford anything under the line in the red triangle. Now let's look at the consumer's preferences. We use so-called indifference curves to represent preferences. An indifference curve shows all the different bundles of cookies and pizzas that you like equally well. Given the 3 conditions we imposed on preferences, we are guaranteed to get a downward sloping indifference curve, although it doesn't need to look as nicely smooth and convex as I've drawn it. If you decide to spend all your money on pizza and cookies, you're looking for a point on the red line that gives you the highest satisfaction. That is the point on the highest indifference curve you can reach. I have drawn that indifference curve. It's the one that just touches the budget line. Any indifference curve that is higher than this one, you cannot afford. So the optimal bundle is the quantity of cookies and pizzas where you reach the highest possible indifference curve. Once you have indifference curves, an individual demand curve is easy to derive. You change the price of one good and see where the new optimum is. You do that for all prices and you get the demand function for that good for that one individual. You can also see that the optimum quantity of cookies changes when you change the price of pizza. All markets are connected. The way I have drawn the second higher indifference curve, reducing the price of pizza leads to a slight increase in the demand for cookies as well. This means that the demand curve for cookies that isn't shown here moves to the right. More cookies are demanded at the same cookie price. Also note that it is possible in principle that the quantity demanded goes down when the price goes down. This would not run counter to the preference conditions. Individual demand curves can therefore look pretty non-standard and not as nicely shaped as shown. To go from individual to total demand, you need to add up all the individual demand curves. You add them up horizontally. That means you add up all the individual quantities demanded at a particular price. As with individual demand curves, the total demand curve need not look anything like this nice downward sloping curve. So does any of this actually make sense? I think it's correct to say that people have preferences over things and that they make some kind of optimization decision in the moment of purchase. I also think that the conditions imposed are far too stringent. Nobody meets them. My preferences are not complete. Large parts of my preference map is unknown territory. I couldn't tell you whether I prefer a yacht to a plane. I can't define demand curves for many things. And for the things I do buy, I don't think I could draw a demand curve. I would say that we discover a lot of our preferences through consumption. How would you know that you like or don't like cheese without tasting it? I think it's pretty obvious that individual preferences are not somehow given. They are socially constructed. Think of fashion or trends where my demand is influenced by that of others. Or think of advertising, where my demand is influenced by the supplier. I actually think that conceiving of demand largely as a habit rather than a choice could be a much more useful approach to the problem. When it comes to transitivity, I can say that I'd rather drink tea than coffee right now. But tomorrow I might go to a coffee shop and buy an expensive espresso, even though I could make tea cheaply at home. I've reversed my preference ordering between the 2 days. Is that irrational of me? When it comes to non-satiation, I never want to have 1,000 cookies at once. I wouldn't enjoy it. Just because it's a convenient assumption doesn't make it sensible. I hope you found this useful, and I leave you with a quote from the economist Karl Kassel on utility theory. Thanks for watching.